Ryse Son of Rome is the greatest example of untapped potential that I have ever seen in a game. Everything about it is good, but there's so much obvious room for improvement that it hurt to play through it. I don't mean that it was so bad that it was painful, rather that everything about the game was bordering greatness without ever actually reaching it. The visuals are fantastic, the combat is engaging, the voice acting is surprisingly competent, and the story was interesting, but I was always left feeling like there could have been more to explore in all these areas except for visuals and voice acting. It's hard to express how close this game is to being great, and it's only because of the sum of its parts that I keep wanting to call it that, but everything individually is just serviceable. It's much better than mediocre, but it doesn't quite reach the heights that it easily could if these systems were given just a little more attention. This is an impression that I'm not very familiar with, the kind where I loved almost every minute of playing this game, but felt like there was so much more that it could achieve. Before getting into the game itself, I'd like to offer a quick summary of what it consists of. Ryse is a third-person hack and slash in a sort of, but not really alternate history of the Roman Empire. It's not quite as accurate as some of the older Assassin's Creed games were, but it uses a similar style of taking real-world figures like Emperor Nero Augustus Germanicus, Commodus, and the Briton tribal leader Boudica. The game takes place during an event called the Boudican Revolt, which was a rebellion started by the Brittonic tribes during the 1st century. The events of the game managed to maintain some amount of historical accuracy while taking its own fair share of liberties, but not so many as to depreciate the conflict that it's trying to recreate. Unless you count divine intervention as depreciation, in which case it might take more liberties than you would like. Still, if you have a strong appreciation for alternate history that tries to maintain some level of integrity for what it's representing, and you have a couple hours to spare, then Ryse is perfect for you. The game is violent, gritty, and the story has its fair share of cliches, but it's still enjoyable. Regardless, there are several things holding this game back, so I suppose we should start taking a look at where the game comes up short. It's only fair to talk about the game's development before laying so much criticism on it. Development for Ryse started in 2006, and the original intention was to be a first-person Kinect game for the Xbox. Both the team and Microsoft eventually decided that this was not the right approach for the project, so in 2011 they started shifting the focus to be more accessible. The project was moved from Crytek Budapest to Crytek's headquarters in Frankfurt, Germany, and the Budapest studio was downsized and put to work developing games for smartphones. Truly a fate worse than getting axed altogether. It really makes EA look merciful by comparison. The developers made 3 prototypes for the game. The first was all Kinect. The second had minimal Kinect features like voice commands, and the third scrapped the features altogether. They eventually decided on the second prototype and got to work developing the game we see today as an Xbox One launch title. Considering that this game was developed in 2 years, I think it's pretty impressive. I'm sure that a large number of the problems I have with this game stem from its short development time, and it no doubt would have been much better had they not tried to squeeze it in with the Xbox One's release. Regardless, and as always, I'll be critiquing what we have, not what could have been. Still, it never hurts to give context to the situation. So, how did Ryse turn out? Honestly, pretty damn good. The graphics of this game speak for itself, and it's very hard to believe that a game from 2013 could look this good. The game has a high level of presentation in its battles and cutscenes, and seeing a large-scale conflict unfold in the backdrop is a real sight to behold. These really do feel like battles you're partaking in, and not just something rendering far away and inaccessible. There's a strong sense of believability during these conflicts, and this game does a great job at making you feel like an active player who is affecting the outcome of a battle. That's not to say that the presentation is perfect, there are cracks that start to show as time goes on, but for the most part I found this game to be a very immersive experience. The presentation does come with its own problems, however. Most of the footage you're seeing is on the medium and lowest setting. Honestly, I could barely tell a difference between the two, and I did encounter frequent frame stutters during some of the missions, specifically those that had a lot of foliage that needed to render. I was recording this on a mid-end PC, and when you consider that I was able to run the game and record simultaneously with only a few moments of instability, I think that's pretty good. Overall, the game looks great, it runs great for the most part, and it's very impressive given the time frame that they made it in. Still, there is much more to this game than just good graphics and smooth animations. I have conflicted feelings with Ryse's gameplay. On the one hand, there are enough interesting mechanics to keep you mostly engaged for the game's duration, but that could also be attributed to the short runtime. Despite that, there are a large number of people who found the combat repetitive and got sick of it before the end of the story. The game only takes about 5 hours to complete, and things can start to feel stale by the end of it, but I still never managed to get bored. Combat makes up the overwhelming majority of gameplay and has the greatest number of problems, but there's some more notable mechanics that I'd like to discuss first. The first of these, which also happen to be some of my favorite moments, are the formation fights. This has you and your squad forming a phalanx as you shield yourself from archers and return fire with your Pila. You're vulnerable when not actively shielding yourselves, and acquiring targets with the Pila takes time, so the challenge comes from timing your shots to prevent your men from dying. It's not a particularly complex system, but it doesn't need to be. Commanding a cohort of Roman legionaries is the main fantasy that this game wants to satisfy, and what better way is there to do this than putting you in charge of a formation? It wasn't until I played this game that I realized just how simple this mechanic is and how absent it is from other medieval battle simulators. It seems like anytime there's a big battle in most games, the main thing the AI focuses on is charging into their inevitable demise. So seeing some actual historical tactics at play is a breath of fresh air, although I do need to admit that the primary reason that I enjoy this system so much is because I just think it's cool, but I still think more games should take advantage of historically realistic fighting tactics. And speaking of tactical decisions, there are several moments that offer you a choice regarding where to place your troops to cover a defensive position. This is a small A or B decision that basically just determines what kind of support you receive and what enemies you'll need to face, but it's still your decision, even if they just change the flavor of the combat encounter. Placing your archers in one position leaves the other exposed, so you're usually given a Scorpio turret to help defend your infantry. These decisions have a minor impact on the gameplay, but they can be more effective than you think. One good example comes midway through the game, where you need to decide whether your ballista fire on the siege towers to force the infantry to climb ladders, which can be easily knocked down, or fire on the catapult to stop them from launching giant flaming rocks at you. Which of these decisions makes the encounter easier is going to heavily depend on the player, but my logic was less infantry, less casualties, so I chose the siege towers at every opportunity. I do need to mention that you are the only person capable of knocking down these ladders, so you'll be doing a lot of running around while your men shout at you that they're being overrun and tell you to go take care of the ladders. This was a little immersion breaking since a trained legionary should be just as capable of knocking down a ladder as you are, but it only happened during this one mission. I didn't see anything else like this throughout the game. Minor decisions like this go a long way towards making you feel like a real commander who is making real tactical decisions, and it's much better than the alternative that most games go for where you're a commander in title only. Between the formation fights, tactical decisions, and commands like calling and covering fire from your archers, Ryse manages to actually make you feel like a leader. The only downside to that last one, and other commands like it, is they're circumstantial and usually a benefit of where you placed your archers during that tactical decision. Still, few games have managed to make me feel like I'm actually in charge of my men the way Ryse did, and the only thing it's lacking that would truly sell this concept are mid-fight commands like those seen in Mount & Blade Warband, but a system like that wouldn't complement Ryse's gameplay anyways. I would also like to mention that when I say the game makes me feel like I'm in charge of the men, I'm mostly referring to how immersive the experience is. If we're judging these systems from a sheer gameplay perspective, then they don't hold up as well. This brings us to the next topic and what makes up a majority of the gameplay, the combat. Ryse's combat is similar in style to the Arkham games, except it does have its own unique formula. For the basics, you have a regular attack, a shield bash, which is used to break an enemy's guard or temporarily stagger them, a deflection, or parry system, and a dodge roll. You also have heavy attacks and heavy shield bashes, but these are a little bit tougher to use and don't flow with the combat as well. Depending on when you time your attacks and deflections determines their effectiveness. For example, timing consecutive hits and bashes properly will perform what is called a perfect combo, which makes each subsequent hit perform faster and build up your crit meter called the Burning Eagle. This meter is lost after your combo is interrupted. Another example are the perfect deflections, which will stagger an enemy harder than usual and can be used against enemy heavy attacks if timed properly. It's also worth noting that you can deflect incoming arrows, and a perfect deflect will launch it back at the shooter. You also have an ability called Focus, which temporarily stuns all nearby enemies and lets you attack with a flurry of strikes. The mode doesn't do enough damage or last long enough to take out an entire group, so I rarely found myself using it. It also doesn't work on bosses, which means that I couldn't rely on it during some of the tougher fights, however few and far between those were. As far as ranged combat goes, you have the Pilum, which requires you to select targets and wait for the reticle to close in before you can throw it. You can block while holding a Pilum, but you can't aim while doing so, and it actually took me an embarrassing amount of time to figure out that there was a defensive option at all. You can also do a quick throw in the middle of combat to get rid of an enemy's shield or hit them with an unblockable attack, but these are clunky to execute and can leave you defenseless long enough for you to get hit. So I seldom attempted it. Still, it is an option. If you do manage to get good at it, then it'll likely save you some headache down the line, as shielded enemies can only be hit once you've broken their guard. Next, we have the executions. These are hands down the best part of Ryse's combat, and they're always satisfying to land. The executions are in the form of a quicktime event, although you can't actually fail. The enemy will flash one of two colors, each indicating what button to press. Blue means attack, yellow means bash. You get a ranking for how precise your timing for the prompt was, with Legendary being the highest and Recruit being the lowest. If you hit the wrong button or miss the prompt, then you automatically get a Recruit ranking. The ranking for the entire execution is determined by the lowest rank of a single prompt, and there can be anywhere from 1 to 4 prompts. You're probably thinking, what's the difference between Legendary and Recruit if you can't actually fail? That's simple. Executions do more than just make you look badass while killing the enemy. They have tangible rewards as well. You get to select whether an execution will gain you health, focus, XP, or a damage buff. I honestly didn't even know that last one was there because I almost always opted for health. You get more than enough XP just by playing the game, and I mentioned earlier how focus isn't useful enough to pass on the other options. The executions themselves are quite impressive. There are 3 types: single, double, and environmental. The single executions are impressive enough, but the double are even more so and make you feel even more like a killing machine. The environmental executions are satisfying to pull off and make up for the fact that you can't simply push enemies into spikes or off a ledge. The only problem I really have with the executions are the timings for Legendary. You would think that the faster the reaction time, the higher the reward, but for some reason the Legendary timings are closer to the middle of the animation, whereas hitting the button right at the start results in a Recruit execution. It's also worth mentioning that there's no way to change the color coding for executions, so colorblind players will need to either watch the animations closely or deal with the Recruit rewards for the entire game. This is only a problem because the game doesn't really have any accessibility settings. I'm not colorblind, so this wasn't an issue that affected me personally, but I did accidentally click off the tutorial before reading it, so I got to experience the hassle of not knowing what button to press for which prompt. This isn't helped by the fact that there's no menu to access the tutorials after you've seen them, so you can't review the information that you've been given. And since we're on the topic of strange decisions regarding the settings, you can't actually customize your keybinds individually. You need to select from a list of control schemes until you find the one that's simply good enough. This shows that the game was obviously made with consoles in mind first, which also explains the panel-based menu screens. Considering this game was designed to be an Xbox launch title, these things do make sense, but the lack of accessibility options is still unusual for a game from 2013. Now that I've explained how these systems work, I can go ahead and tell you some of the issues I've noticed. Let's start with some more general problems that I had with gameplay. The smallest inconvenience I noticed were UI prompts appearing when you're not actually in position to trigger them. The most common example for this is when you're prompted to pick up some Pila, but you're not actually close enough to do so. You can see the UI telling you to press the button to pick them up, but all pressing this button does is make you twirl your sword as your men get pelted by arrows in the background. The range that displays the prompt is larger than the range that allows you to activate it. It's also worth noting that there are no UI hints whenever an enemy is about to attack you. This is fine in smaller fights since you can see what's going on, but it can be annoying in the larger encounters when an enemy attacks you from behind or at the same time as another enemy you're already deflecting. Having an indicator for incoming attacks would be a great quality of life improvement, because as it stands, the only danger indicators are for enemy heavy attacks and incoming arrows. The heavy attacks cause enemies to glow red, and the arrows have an icon that appears on your HUD. There's an even bigger issue with the combat though, and it's regarding its depth. You only really have 4 methods of attack and 2 defensive options. There isn't really any room to express yourself with this combat system. Heavy attacks don't flow well in combat. In fact, they flow so poorly that they oftentimes failed to execute whenever I tried to use them. Heavy bashes function much better, but neither of these can be weaved into your combo to keep the momentum going once you've built up your Burning Eagle. The heavy attack misfires just interrupt the flow of combat, and the light attack chains got repetitive very quickly. Your combo chains are usually going to end up the exact same way every time. Bash an enemy to create an opening, do 1 or 2 light attacks, bash again, rinse and repeat. I would occasionally throw in a heavy bash or heavy attack to switch things up, but as I said before, this runs the risk of breaking the combo entirely by simply not executing. This causes every fight to feel pretty much the exact same, with the only difference being the enemies on the field, which means the only real difference is how many times you have to bash or deflect before you're given an opening. This brings another problem with it too: enemy variety. The game is surprisingly lacking in this category, with there only really being 5 types of enemies. Basic grunts, grunts that use heavy attacks, shield enemies, dual wielders who can dodge your attacks and require 3 deflections to gain an opening, and the larger enemies that are immune to all light attacks unless you get a perfect deflect on their heavy attacks. The models of these enemies will change, but the mechanics won't. There is one more enemy type worth mentioning that I'll save for the story discussion since it contains spoilers, but their only difference is that they have a different kind of heavy attack that is handled the exact same way as all the rest: perfect deflect or dodge out of the way. There are actually more executions in this game than there are enemy types. There's also a surprising lack of progression to make up for these shortcomings. There are upgrades in this game, but the only thing they do is increase your health, focus, XP gain, pylum carrying capacity, execution bonuses, or the number of hits it takes to activate your Burning Eagle. I believe that unlocking execution bonuses also unlocks new executions along the way, but the game is so short that I honestly couldn't be sure. You don't unlock new combos or abilities, everything is just a number tweak, and you're given so much XP over the course of the game that I never even bothered fully upgrading my XP gain. I never felt like I was getting more skilled over the course of the game, and this seriously hurts the experience. There's one way that a system like this could have worked, and it ties into the final problem I had with the gameplay. Ryse is way too easy. I played on the highest difficulty available without beating the game, and I almost never struggled. That's not to say that I never died, that happened a few times, but I never felt like I was really struggling to get through the combat encounters. The game could have made the system work if the progression came from a steady increase in player skill. The only game I can think of that has a system like this is Fury, and I've never played it before, so I don't want to use it as an example. Unfortunately for Ryse, the only thing that keeps the game from getting stale is the fact that it only takes 5 hours to complete, so by the time you feel competent with the game's combat, it's over. Really though, the number one reason that I didn't struggle with the game's combat is because taking damage wasn't punishing enough. Even on the highest difficulty available to me at the time, I could easily shrug off attacks and regain any lost health through executions. The boss fights were a little more tedious, but that's all they were. Tedious. There's so little punishment for sloppy play and so few ways to switch up your tactics that the entire system left me wanting more. So, to summarize Ryse's gameplay, it does a great job at making you feel like a badass Roman commander, but does a terrible job at giving you a competent challenge. There aren't enough ways to express yourself with the combat system, so the most exciting parts of the fight end up being the various executions. The low enemy variety makes it feel like you're fighting the same enemies over and over, and a lack of meaningful progression means that there's nothing to keep these encounters feeling fresh. Overall, the gameplay is serviceable at best, and it's a shame because there's so much potential here. Still, we haven't even seen the worst of it yet. I'd like to say up front that I think Ryse's story is very good, but if the most common point I've made in this video is that the game barely reaches its potential, then nothing made me feel this way more than the story. There are only 8 missions, taking about 5 hours to complete, but it still manages to tell a very competent story. The game's short length doesn't really leave the story feeling rushed, it just feels underexplained. Not in the way that it's confusing or full of plot holes, but rather that many of the plot points needed more time to cook in order for them to have the intended payoff. I really wonder if the decision to have 8 story missions came first, forcing the writers to squeeze the events into a narrow window, or if they just didn't want to keep the player away from the action long enough for them to reflect on what just happened. One thing is for certain, the devs wanted to throw the player into the action as quickly as humanly possible. It's a shame because there are very few quiet moments where you're given a chance to think about everything that's happened, with most of them occurring in the last few missions. It almost feels like the end of the game was written first, and then the beginning was added with the intention of getting to those moments as quickly as possible. This isn't to say that the first half of the game is bad, there's still a really high level of quality throughout, but the beginning definitely wasn't given the time it needed for the game to have a solid foundation. The true benefit of the game's story being short is that I can discuss the events in greater detail than I would otherwise. If there's a game that's worth inspecting the minor details of, it's definitely this one. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the story. There will be spoilers from this point forward. The game begins with a cutscene of the Emperor running through the palace as chunks of the ceiling begin to fall around him. Also, just ignore this press spacebar to skip icon, it doesn't go away. He makes it to a large statue of himself, which starts bleeding out its eyes. He then starts shouting, "He's here," and runs off. He heads to a nearby balcony overlooking the battle and starts demanding that they defend him, because everybody knows that exposing yourself to the enemy is the greatest act of self-preservation. You then get a quick glimpse of the main character, Marius Titus. He hands a nearby centurion a bag and orders him to display it at the highest place he can find, claiming that the barbarians will retreat whenever they see it. After this, you're given the tutorial and walk through the basics of combat. I'd like to take a moment to discuss Marius' character. He's essentially a Roman version of Kratos, and John Hopkins did a phenomenal job with his performance. One of the reasons that I enjoyed this game so much is because if you were to change the setting to Greece, change the characters, and make it a prequel to God of War where you play as Kratos during his time as a Spartan general, it would be a perfect fit. Marius is very calculated, highly intelligent, and absolutely ruthless, which makes him the perfect protagonist for this game. You fight your way to the palace gates and get your first tactical position section, although you're not really given a choice about where to place them. You then man the Scorpio and help hold the line until the barbarians are deterred, after which you head into the palace to help defend the Emperor. He continues rambling on about somebody who's after him, claiming that he's not even concerned about the barbarians. Marius tells him that they need to find somewhere safe, and you make your way to somewhere called the Vaults. This has you fighting through the palace and taking out a mini-boss before proceeding. The Emperor opens a secret passage behind his throne and you both descend into the Vaults. The Emperor then claims that Damocles has risen from the dead and is now after him, and Marius assures him that Damocles is just a myth. He says that the gods don't interfere with the affairs of mortals, and the Emperor demands to know how Marius knows this. Marius tells him that he learned it from his father. The Emperor asks Marius what his name is, and he says that his name isn't important, but his story is. Everything from here on out will be told via flashback. Yes, it's one of those games. Instead of complaining about how cliche this is, let's just go ahead and move on. Marius says that his story begins 10 years ago, and you see him return home just after finishing his training for the Legion, where you're introduced to his father, Leontius. He makes this ominous comment that not all your enemies will be found on the battlefield, but you're interrupted by his mother before he has a chance to elaborate. She tries to drag you away to see your sister, but Leontius stops her and says that he needs to speak to you in private. After this, you're given the tutorial and walk through the basics of combat. Wait, what? Yeah, apparently the developers had so little faith in the player's ability that they decided to issue a second tutorial that holds your hand even more than the first one. This can't be skipped, and you can't proceed unless you've done the checklist that has been prepared for you. Keep in mind that you've already fought your way through several waves of enemies and a mini-boss, so they could very easily have told you about perfect combos during the prologue. Once the game has decided to release its death grip from your hand, you hear that there's unrest in Rome and the upcoming Senate election is going to have a great impact. Leontius pulls out a dagger and begins telling you a story that he wants you to remember whenever you start commanding troops yourself. This is where you learn the story of Damocles, a Roman general who was abandoned by his fellow commanders during a battle and left to fight on his own, leading to his death. When he arrived in the underworld, the goddess of revenge, Nemesis, was enraged at how he was treated and sent him back into the world as a black armored centurion to kill the generals who wronged him. Roman commanders carry a dagger with the image of Damocles on the scabbard as a reminder to care for their men or risk Damocles returning to murder them for their mistakes. This should automatically cast suspicion on the Emperor for being afraid that Damocles is after him. After the story is finished, you see Marius' mother being chased by barbarians, and by the time you reach them, both her and his sister have been killed. I don't feel like I really need to go into why this is an issue, but I will anyways for the sake of being thorough. Many writers make the mistake of killing off characters shortly after their introduction and wrongfully assuming that the player is going to care. This is sort of a cliche in gaming, but it can also be seen in movies and some books. I think the reason this happens is a matter of perspective. Whenever a writer creates a character and their background, they become invested in it, so whenever the character dies, it matters to them. From the player's perspective, we don't know these people, so we have literally no reason to care about them unless you're the type of player that plays the game almost entirely from an emotional perspective. To Marius, this is a traumatic experience. He just watched his mother and sister die, but to the player, well, we don't even get to meet the sister, much less see her face, so I don't see how this is supposed to have any serious impact. It's also the first example of the game rushing to throw you into the action, much to the detriment of the story. This is a really big issue for the story, but it's so common in video games that I don't think it requires a lot of explanation as to why. You're quickly ambushed by more barbarians and fight your way through the city streets, eventually getting separated as a shield barbarian attacks you. You then try to find Leontius, but don't know which way to go. Thankfully, a woman in a skimpy yellow dress shows you the way. Oh, and she's a goddess. I'm sure we won't be seeing any more of her. You meet up with Leontius and get to work killing more barbarians. He tells you to go find a man named Plautius from the amphitheater and bring him to the forum. You make it there just in time to watch him get assassinated, so you kill more barbarians and then reunite with Leontius. You do more fighting until he is eventually killed by a barbarian. With his dying breath, he tells you to save Rome. More specifically, save it from them. This death has a slightly bigger impact considering you got more time with Leontius than you did the rest, but you'll still be hard-pressed to actually care. You're then immediately met by Commander Vitalian of the 14th Cohort. He tells you that he served with your father and promises to help you get revenge against the barbarians. He then transfers you to the 14th, which I have to ask. Can he do that? This is a serious question. Can you just poach a soldier without the consent of their current CO? Well, whether this is legal or not, he does it anyways, so welcome to the 14th. You then cut back to Marius telling this to the Emperor, where you learn that the rebellion that led to your family's death started on the island of Britannia, which would be modern-day Britain. You and the 14th head there to try and stop the rebellion, and of course, get your revenge. Just as you prepare to arrive at a port in Britannia, the harbor chains are raised, and a catapult starts attacking your fleet. Your ship is wrecked and you're knocked overboard. You then see a white figure on a nearby rock which disappears after a wave hits you. With no other option, you swim to shore and try to lower the chains for the rest of your fleet. You rescue the scattered Roman soldiers as you make your way through and get to witness the death of one of your centurions. Marius uses this as an opportunity to assume a leadership position and start organizing a resistance against the barbarians as you head for the chain tower. This is going to come down to personal preference, but I thought it felt really cool to just step in and start organizing the troops you rescue. Hearing the ones you saved previously encouraged encourage the newer rescues to do as you say. It adds a slight dynamic that makes this distinct from other games where rescuing the friendly AI doesn't feel like it has any real impact. This has helped even more whenever you finally rescue enough legionaries to form a phalanx and march on the tower. If we're being realistic here, this isn't anything impressive from a gameplay perspective. The Romans you save serve no purpose in combat, and you'll still be doing all the heavy lifting. My main point is that Ryse sells the illusion that you're commanding these troops much better than most cinematic military simulators. And what is immersion but a highly believable illusion? The reason I said that it comes down to personal preference is because not everybody is going to feel the same way about it, but I still think it's worth noting that Ryse puts in a great effort to make you feel like you're gathering a strong resistance of fighters, even if the reality is that you're still doing everything by yourself. Just compare something like this to saving the Marines in the beginning of Halo, and you'll start to see why I feel like Ryse's lies are a bit more convincing. Getting back on track, you and your men secure the chain tower and start raising the counterweight so you can destroy it. You defend the troops from archers long enough for them to raise the counterweight to the top of the tower and then drop it. This destroys the tower in the process, and Marius jumps onto a passing ship to join the main force heading for the beach. I often wonder what happened to the soldiers you just abandoned. Marius then gives a motivational speech to the men on the ship and basically takes command of everybody on board. This next scene is essentially Roman D-Day, complete with its own Saving Private Ryan reference. It's difficult not to let my impressions of this game be colored by the fact that I think stuff like this is really cool, but there were several times while playing where I would have to stop and admire the spectacle of what's going on. There's something satisfying about being part of a large-scale battle with dozens of players on the field that I can't really describe, and I do at least want to acknowledge that I had a difficult time getting past the sheer spectacle of this encounter. Unfortunately, the lackluster combat means the developers failed to capitalize on this feeling that they managed to evoke for me and many other players. However, there is something wrong with this section of the story, and it's the same thing I just praised about the game a minute ago: believability. I can believe that Marius managed to pull together 10 to 15 survivors and march on a single chain tower, and even a ship full of soldiers who witnessed it happen, but I have a hard time believing that Marius managed to gain the loyalty of several platoons of soldiers who just arrived. By this point, you've regrouped with the main force, so where are the rest of the Centurions? We saw one of them die, but that couldn't have been the only one in charge of an entire fleet of soldiers. This issue first became apparent whenever Marius says this:
"We've got to hold this barricade until our archers get here. Legionaries! Form a line!"
This implies that you, a recruit legionary, are going to assume command of soldiers who haven't even arrived on the beach yet. Unless news of your heroics has already reached the ships who haven't arrived yet, or more and more soldiers are pushing for the rest to listen to what you say, then this isn't believable. The illusion is beginning to shatter. I'm not an expert on these things, but I still find it highly unlikely that anybody who wasn't already saved by Marius would have any reason to listen to him, especially a group of archers who wouldn't have any knowledge of what we did yet. The situation is possible, but it feels highly unlikely. You get to work trying to take the fort, which has you fighting your way to a nearby catapult. You use this catapult to take out the only other catapult, and then the real bulk of the force proceeds to storm the rest of the fort. Vitalian arrives and tells you that many officers were killed in the battle. He recognizes your leadership capabilities and promotes you straight to Centurion. He then gives the men a pretty impressive motivational speech, and you receive news that King Oswald and his barbarians are marching on York. Your next job is to head there and try to stop them. But before we do that, let's go ahead and back up to discuss something else. It may not feel like it, but we are 1/3 of the way through the game. The events of the first two missions, ignoring the prologue, don't give the plot any real time to take off. You don't get to spend enough time as a Legion recruit before you're promoted to Centurion, which is just another thing that harms any semblance of progression in this game. This is the second major plot point that fails to have any real value because it happens too quickly. Your family dies within 5 minutes of meeting them, and you become a Centurion within 30 minutes of your first real battle. This would be much more impactful if you did get to spend at least a single mission working under another Centurion and experiencing the grunt work before finally getting your time to shine. That would also fix the problem I had before with you just assuming command of all these men. If your sentry had witnessed your combat prowess and leadership skills before your Centurion died on the beach, then it would make a lot of sense if they flocked to you the second there was a vacuum of power. This would also give off a greater sense of camaraderie, as this wouldn't be your first time fighting with these men. Your journey to York happens off-screen, something you'll notice happens often in this game. Marius informs Vitalian that a large barbarian army is marching for York right now, and if they merge with the army nearby, then the city will be lost. Vitalian says that if they can capture King Oswald and his daughter Boudica, then the tribes will be forced to make peace with Rome, and Oswald will be forced to swear fealty to the Emperor. Marius doesn't like the idea, and the conversation goes like this:
"These vermin dare to stand against the might of Rome. They deserve to suffer our retribution."
Our retribution? or yours?
Sir,
Enough! We will end this rebellion my way and not put the lives of good men at unnecessary risk. Is that understood, Centurion?
understood, Commander.
You're then told that you'll be the one capturing Oswald and Boudica, but you first need to take out the archers posted on the aqueduct so you can get your men through safely. This has you sneaking behind enemy lines where you're introduced to the dual wielders and traps. The traps are pretty basic, just requiring you to hit the deflection button as to not get impaled. The dual wielders have a bit more going on. They can dodge your attacks and require you to bash them 3 times before you get an opening. Additionally, you need to deflect 3 of their attacks in order to stagger them. If they hit you once during this sequence, then they won't be staggered after the barrage is complete. You eventually make it to the aqueduct tower and take out the ballistae. Once you do, you're confronted by Boudica, who serves as this game's first boss. The bosses in this game aren't very good for multiple reasons, but I'll go into more detail about each fight when I get to them. Boudica's moveset is identical to the dual wielders, with the only difference being that she ends her barrage with a heavy attack. She's actually easier to fight than the dual wielders because she's susceptible to heavy attacks. Needless to say, she's a pushover. She runs off after you beat her, and after killing her guards, she cuts a rope to drop a giant stone on your head. Marius rolls out of the way and does basically the exact same thing to a group of archers, except he uses a pilum, so it's more impressive. You regroup with your men and form a phalanx as you head into the mound that serves as their palace. Once you've made your way inside, you're stopped by a group of archers on the other side of a bridge, so you go around to take them by surprise where your men hold the line. Once inside the throne room, you fight off Oswald's guard, including 2 dual wielders with fire swords. Don't worry, this is only a cosmetic change. Boudica gets bitch slapped by a shield, and Marius uses her as leverage to make Oswald surrender. You bring them back to town where you see people being whipped and crucified. This is where the story presents one of its strongest themes, that the so-called civilization you live under has its own form of barbarism, and that the Britons look much more peaceful in comparison.
This must be the work of the Praetorians.
Oh, never mind, I guess we'll just deflect it by putting the blame on a small minority of Romans instead of acknowledging that this was a popular form of punishment back in the day. Talk about a missed opportunity to show the contrast between tribal and civil life, and that the things Rome considered civil was actually barbaric. I also noticed during this scene that the people aren't being crucified on crosses, but rather X's. I mean, I guess it's still technically considered a cross, but you know what I mean. I assume the developers were afraid of using a religious symbol in reference to crucifixion, even though that's literally where the symbol came from, but you can't blame them for trying to avoid controversy. One thing I do find kind of strange is how Marius looks shocked to see people being crucified, despite the fact that it wasn't uncommon back in ancient Rome, especially to enemies of the state. I think the scene could have shown the moral nuance between what the Romans consider acceptable and civilized compared to what the Britons do. As it stands, this entire scene just comes off as crucifixion bad, therefore Praetorians bad. And did a game really need to tell us that crucifixion is bad when it released in a time where people argue about the morality of lethal injection, which is much more humane than tying or nailing people up on a cross and breaking their legs until they suffocate to death? This entire scene really exists to show the player that the Praetorians are the bad boys of the Legion. This is made even funnier when you think back on what Marius said at the start of the last mission. This really should be a scene where Oswald and Boudica are in shock to see this, while Marius and Vitalian treat it like just another day at the office. Maybe have Marius make a comment about how they're lucky that they aren't next. Anyways, you meet the Emperor's son, Basilius. Vitalian tries to get fair treatment for Oswald and Boudica in an effort to keep the peace, and Basilius informs you that his brother Commodus is still missing and that he'll interrogate Oswald until he finds out where he is. The interrogations go quickly whenever Basilius threatens to kill Boudica, and you learn that Commodus was given to even more savage tribes up north beyond Hadrian's Wall. Basilius tasked Vitalian and the 14th with going to retrieve him. Once again, the entire journey happens off-screen. When you arrive, Vitalian tells you that the savages here build wicker men only for their most valuable sacrifices, so you need to attack after dark before they kill him. You and your cohort slowly advance through the forest as the tribals stalk you from the trees. The sequence ends with a fireball coming in, knocking everybody off a narrow bridge like a bunch of bowling pins, destroying the bridge in the process. You and Vitalian defend yourselves from the savages that totally aren't just reskinned barbarians, and after winning in the game, you lose in the cutscene. Vitalian is defeated by one of the tribals, and Marius is given a concussion by their leader Glot. They carry him off, and Glot punts you off the side of a cliff. You're then woken up by the goddess again, except this time you get a good look at that dress I mentioned earlier. She tells him to rise, and he does, but he also gets up in the process. You gather your gear and try to locate the rest of your men. You're introduced to the heavy warrior that is only affected by heavy attacks unless you stagger him with a perfect deflection. You fight your way through the forest until you find your captured men, then free them from their cages. Just like the mission before, I find something oddly satisfying about rescuing these men and organizing a force to be reckoned with. One of the troops says that Vitalian was taken to the Wicker Man, so you get everybody in formation evacuation and make your way there. You'll then find yourself in a swamp where the tribals are burning the cages full of your men. This starts a defense section where you need to prioritize killing the tribal that holds the torch, but you can't do the common sense thing of just freeing them the second you get there, and you need to wait until after you've deterred the enemies first. Once you've saved everybody, you make it to the Wicker Man. Vitellion is set up to burn first, and you need to fight Glot in order to free him. Glot's boss fight was much more tedious than Boudica's. He has the same moveset as the heavy enemies in this level, except he's resistant to heavy attacks himself. The only way to hit him is to get a perfect deflection on one of his heavy attacks, which means I ended up taking a ton of damage until I got the timing right. This also made the entire fight feel artificially extended, as I was forced to wait until he attacked in order to get my chance. Occasionally, Glot will charge you and you'll enter a quick time event that you can actually fail. Once his health reaches halfway, you enter the second phase of the fight, and the biggest difference is that the Wicker Man falls over and Glot regains some of his health. The only real difference is that Glot will charge you more often, so you get more chances to attack. This isn't really enough to make the encounter any less boring, and this entire boss fight falls flat. After he's dead, your men grab a battering ram that materialized out of thin air and bring down the Wicker Man to save Vitellion. You also get a chance to save Commodus, and words cannot describe how grateful he is.
Get me out of here, you stupid fools! I command you!
You march back to Rome where Oswald is ready to accept peace. Vitellion and Marius are tired of war and ready for it to come to an end. You find yourself at the signing where Oswald only asks that his people are treated as equals under Roman law. Instead of a scroll, Commodus presents a dagger, claiming it to be the Emperor's seal. He then tells Oswald to embrace him, and when he does, he stabs him to death with the dagger. Truly, nobody could have seen this coming. Marius notices the seal on the dagger, and it's the same one as the sword that killed Leontius. This is a small detail that's easy to miss during that scene, but it proves that the barbarians didn't kill his family. The Emperor did. When Leontius said save Rome from them, he was talking about the royal family. This revelation probably won't come as a shock, but I do appreciate the way that Marius finds out about the deception. It also explains why the royals have been presented as such bastards. Boudica goes for the knife, but the royal advisor dressed in white stops her, saying that now isn't the time. The same thing happens when he touches her that happened to you in the beginning, proving that this man is a god. More importantly though, he appears to be the same figure you saw after your ship crashed during the third mission. He then tells her to run, so she does. Commodus didn't seem to think that the barbarians in the city would continue revolting after they witnessed him murder their king in front of him, so he retreats the second things get violent, ordering Vitellion to stay behind and hold the city at any cost. He orders the men to reinforce the walls, then tells you that he needs time to evacuate the civilians, saying that he'll meet you at the courthouse when it's done. You get a look at the army that you're facing, and there are at least 10,000 men marching on York with siege towers and artillery ready, and it makes me wonder, how the hell did they organize this invasion so quickly? Oswald was just literally murdered, and I seriously doubt that the Romans would have held the peace summit here if they had an army in their back door. It would take a significant amount of time to mobilize a force like this, much less build that many siege towers. This is the section I mentioned earlier about deciding what forces you want your ballistae to take out and where your soldiers refuse to kick down a ladder by themselves. You defend this position for several waves, being given at least 3 opportunities to select targets for your ballistae. You're ultimately unable to hold them off and are forced to retreat. You help support the evacuation as you make your way to the courthouse to meet up with Vitellion. He tells you that Commodus and his guards took the warship from Rome during their escape, so the civilians will need to evacuate on the rest of the boats. Marius says that you need to get word to the Senate about what Commodus has done, and Vitellion agrees. You head to the bridge and help your troops fall back and get to man the Scorpio as you retreat. It's on a wagon and it seems like it would be much quicker just to run, but who would want to pass up on a cool turret section? After fighting your way back through the courthouse, you make it to Vitellion, who offers to stay behind and hold off the barbarians while the final ship leaves. Marius refuses, saying that he's the commander and only the Senate will listen to him. This next section is a suicide mission where you hold off waves of barbarians until the ship is gone. It's basically this game's version of Lone Wolf from Halo Reach, except you still need to survive in order to win. Once you've held them off long enough, Marius is knocked off the bridge and into the canal. York is now in the control of the barbarians. The White God tries to spot your body, but he runs off whenever he sees the goddess who's been helping you. She takes the dagger of Damocles and drops it into the canal. Once it touches your hand, you hear somebody whisper Damocles and Marius wakes up. Just to clarify, Marius did actually die right here, but he has been resurrected by this goddess to take up the mantle of Damocles. To put it another way, you are no longer Marius, you are Damocles. This is confirmed by the Emperor after the cut back to modern times.
Marius Titus, you are a general of Rome. I brought you here to protect me from Damocles. But you are Damocles! God's protect. You are Damocles!
Indeed I am. And my story is almost at an end. I became driven by one thought, one solitary desire. The desire for vengeance. Vengeance against the Emperor Nero, who had my family butchered. Vengeance against his despicable sons, who betrayed my legion!
I know I said it once already, but I really love the voice acting in this game. Marius proceeds to talk about his journey back to Rome as he hears tales of the land falling into lawlessness and citizens being tortured. This next level is the same as the beginning, except in reverse. You're traveling back to your home through the same streets as before, and dare I say, it actually has an impact. Seeing the once clean streets littered with the tents of the homeless and this wealthy district of the city reduced to a slum, it's actually interesting because you get to see for yourself how badly things have gotten out of hand. You eventually find some Praetorians trying to rape a woman because we've already established that the Praetorians are evil, and you step in to stop them. They try and kill you, so you kill them instead. The Praetorians work similar to every other shielded enemy, except they also have their own heavy bash that doubles as a heavy attack. This would be where the game increases in challenge if the combat wasn't so brainless. After killing them, you're officially a fugitive of the law. There hasn't been a mission up until this point where you truly feel like you're on your own, but this mission does a great job at evoking that. In the next area, you find a pit of dead bodies. You overhear the soldiers talking about it, where you learn that somebody drew the Emperor's face on a horse's ass, so they executed the entire street. You then make it back to your home, where Marius starts to reminisce over the events of the past. The goddess who's been helping you appears, and this is where you find out exactly why this happened. Leontius was a former general and popular senator, and his popularity made the emperor jealous. She says that a cold wind from the north, that being the god of the north wind, started deceiving the emperor. Leontius and the other senators wanted to give the people more power, so the emperor had them killed. He then distributed the wealth and power between his sons, Basilius and Commodus. The goddess then says that you are a vital piece in the, quote, game of man. She then reminds you that you are Damocles, the spirit of vengeance, and then tells you to save Rome from the emperor and his sons. This is the part where Marius completely goes off the deep end, and I love it. He forges himself a suit of armor in the image of Damocles and makes his way to Basilius seeking entry into the emperor's tournament. I also love how Basilius almost slips up and admits that he's afraid of Damocles coming after him.
You gave me quite the shock. Only the most skilled fighters can enter the tournament.
I completely missed this detail my first time through. He wants to make sure you're worthy of entering the tournament, so he pits you against several gladiators that you are required to execute. If you fail to execute them, you failed the mission. Once you're done killing everybody, you meet with Basilius in private. He gives you the scroll of entry and then tells you about the statue he's making in the image of Emperor Nero. He says that it's designed to make the eyes cry white wine to symbolize his love for the empire, but it can technically be designed to cry anything. Marius then stabs him and kicks the bowl underneath his dying corpse. Yeah, you know how the statue's eyes start bleeding and it scares the hell out of the emperor in the beginning? That was his son's blood. You then find an oracle who's been tied up in the room. She says to cut her loose if you want to know the future, and once you do, she tells you that Damocles will only be killed by General Marius, and Marius will be killed by Damocles, but Emperor Nero can only die by his own sword, so we can't kill him. Marius then takes Basilius' blood and dumps it into the head of the statue, then proceeds to the Colosseum. Marius speaks to himself how Commodus has taken all of our achievements and claimed them as his own, and the Colosseum is where he boasts about it. Just a little historical reference about Commodus. He wasn't actually the son of Nero Augustus Germanicus. He was a different emperor who frequently performed as a gladiator in the Colosseum during his rule. He was also said to have had a massive god complex.
My father is a god! I am a god! Obey me! As you obey the gods!
Yeah, sounds about right. Getting back to the story, the champion of the arena earns the right to fight Commodus himself. You recreate the events of the last few missions until he offers 1,000 denarii for anyone who can kill you. He then ridicules you for trying to recreate the events of his success, which is bound to hurt somebody's pride while they play. Commodus then gives a speech about how he's going to kill you, and the Emperor tells the god of the North Wind, who he calls Aquilo, that he's worried that Commodus will lose. He's not worried about his life, he's just worried that he'll lose the fortune that he bet for him to win. Aquilo says that he will shorten the odds in Commodus' favor. If you're wondering why it took me so long to call this god by his name, it's because I didn't think it was ever actually said in game until I rewatched the footage. Commodus is the toughest boss fight in the game, and he's still incredibly easy. He will deflect your heavy attacks, so you're required to deflect his heavy attacks to get an opening. The challenge isn't in the fight itself, it's in the fact that he has two separate heavy attacks with similar telegraphs, so I kept missing the timing. This was the only boss in the entire game that killed me, and all that did was reset my health, so it actually made the fight easier afterwards. After knocking his health down enough, you enter a cutscene where Marius knocks him down, but Commodus hits you with some pocket sand when you're not looking. The crowd starts booing him after, and then they call in 5 more soldiers who look exactly like Commodus. He then starts taunting you, so it's not even a challenge as to which one is him. And he didn't even move, so I don't see how this is meant to be a diversion. You kill all the imposters and then proceed to fight Commodus with no changes to how the fight worked the first time. And just as you're about to kill him, you're hit with poisonous gas, which is how Aquilo intends to shorten the odds. They then bring in more imposters who require you to block a single attack so they can be killed via cutscene. I don't know why they didn't just make it one big quit time event, because switching from gameplay to cutscene after pressing a single button is awkward. Commodus lets his ego get the best of him and you get a couple of good slices, which puts you in the final phase where Commodus has half health. That is the only difference between this phase and the first two. Marius then kills Commodus and does this.
I am Damocles. I am vengeance. You are next.
The Emperor sends in his Praetorians to a quick death, and you escape. Vitalian catches up with you later that night, and after confirming that you're still alive, he tells you it's time to finish what Leontius started. He tells you that he warned the Senate about Britannia, but all the leaders with backbone died in the assassinations at the start of the game. Commodus, who was in charge of the Legion, held them back and refused to do anything about the rebellion. The Briton army has grown tenfold, and all Rome's enemies have allied with them. He then tells you that since Commodus is dead, they'll ask him to assume command, so he wants you to be his general to help defend against the incoming invasion. Marius agrees to set aside his vengeance in order to save Rome. You then hear Marius talk about how he sympathizes with Boudica and laments that she punished all of Rome for Nero's actions, but then says that he refuses to let the empire fall. The next mission begins as barbarians siege the city. You start off on the Scorpio and defend the soldiers who are holding the line. You need to prioritize the archers, heavy soldiers, and war elephants to prevent them from breaking through. You do this for a while until Marius offers to lead a countercharge. This time, Vitalian says that he's going to lead it and doesn't let you go. You then get to watch him tear through the place in the cutscene until Boudica arrives on an elephant. Vitalian throws a pylon into its eye, killing it and knocking her off. She almost takes his head off in a surprise attack, but those mutton chops on the helmet did their job and protected him. You gather reinforcements to try and give him some support, but you first need to clear away wreckage to make it to him. You hold the line while some people clear it away, then you make your way there. Unfortunately for Vitalian, it's almost the end of the game, so he's killed by Boudica before you reach him. You're then knocked out by an incoming fireball, but you're saved by the goddess, whose name's Summer, by the way. I hadn't brought it up before now since her name isn't said in game, but we've already name dropped Aquilo, so I guess it's time. This will be the 3rd or 4th time that she saved you in this game, and she tells you to cut off the head of the rebellion to end the siege. You're then met by a centurion who came to tell you that the soldiers can't hold them off for much longer. A strong wind comes out of nowhere, which convinces the man that the gods don't favor them and they need to retreat. Marius chews him out for being a coward, then gives him orders on where to pull the troops to. You then gather some troops to cut off and eliminate Boudica. You use the Scorpio to kill her elephant and knock her into the canal, then chase her to the Forum. This fight with Boudica is identical to the one at the beginning of the game. This is the final boss of the game, and it is identical to the very first. This is also another fight that has multiple phases with no real change between them, so that's another thing to be disappointed about. Once she's defeated, she gives you the whole "we're not that different" speech. You two acknowledge some mutual respect, and Marius is hesitant to kill her. She insists that he do it, and so he does. I have thoughts about this scene that I'll save for the end. We then cut straight to the moment from the beginning of the game where Marius hands the Centurion a bag, which we now know is containing Boudica's head, but probably could have worked out that it was something similar from the start of the game anyways, and cut again to the tunnels with Emperor Nero. He stops you from killing him, reminding him of the Oracle's words, then asks for the dagger so he can at least die like an emperor. You then hear a banging on the door, and once Nero realizes that it's his Praetorians, he runs off shouting for help. You then find yourself in a long hallway where Aquilo stops you. He then scolds you for disrupting his plans, and you see via flashback that he was the one responsible for everything, including using his power to manipulate Nero and Boudica. He claims to have done it in order to destroy Rome and end civilization. Summer warns you too late that Nero is behind you, and he stabs you with the dagger. You also learn that this entire thing is nothing more than a competition between Aquilo and Summer. You slowly make your way down the hallway as you're ambushed by Praetorians along the way, and this is basically just one big QuickTime event. Marius has a hard time handling the attacks after being stabbed by Nero, and he gets stabbed several more times along the way. Finally, he charges Nero off the ledge, causing him to impale himself on the sword of his statue, thus fulfilling the prophecy and dying by his own sword. Marius then lays on the ground and dies of blood loss. Aquilo gives Summer a brief nod, and they go their separate ways. You hear Summer narrate that Rome eventually recovered to its former glory, and you see a statue that they erected in honor of Marius. And that's the end of the game. I like this ending. I feel that it's a satisfying conclusion to this story, and a greater conclusion for Marius' character. It makes sense for him to die in the end because he was only resurrected to take up the mantle of Damocles. With Nero dead, he had no reason to go on living. The ending is certainly dramatic, but the entire game is dramatic. There isn't a single moment of comic relief in this game, and I think it's all the better because of it. It does strike me as a bit odd that Aquilo would want to destroy Rome simply because we live in a society, but I do like how that detail is set up. Summer told Marius that he's instrumental in the game of man, and you then learn that she meant that literally. This entire thing was just a game orchestrated by the gods, and it can be seen at every turn. Summer marked you as her champion. Whenever Aquilo tried to destroy your fleet, you led the men to victory. Whenever he uses the royal family as a means to weaken Rome, you take the mantle of Damocles to start assassinating them. Then you kill Aquilo's champion, Boudica. Notice how whenever the gods touch somebody, they would sometimes leave a glowing mark. Summer did this for you in the beginning, and Aquilo did it to Boudica after Oswald was killed. I think this explains your near supernatural fighting ability. The fact that you could withstand a poisonous gas that should have killed you, and handle being stabbed repeatedly without downing. Then look at Boudica and how she was able to organize a massive army after being touched by Aquilo, and showing a great enough combat prowess to kill Vitalian, only going down after you cut off her head. I noticed while rewatching the footage that there's a glowing aura coming out of Marius' stab wounds after Nero's death, and it's only after it's gone that he starts choking on his own blood. Unless this was placed here for literally no reason, then it seems to me like this is his power leaving him. This sounds cool, but I don't want to put too much stake in it because it's not like it's particularly explained in-game. And that's just the problem. The finer details of this game feel underexplained. I still think the story is a little undercooked. The beginning wasn't given enough time to really set up the events of the game, and the end result feels like it's rushing to the climax as quickly as possible. The game relies a little too heavily on cliches, like murdering your entire family before you're given a chance to care about them, and it makes its own mistakes along the way. The first 4 missions of the game have spectacle, but they lack substance. It wasn't until the Siege of York, which also happens to be the last 2 hours of the game, that things really started to get interesting. It seems like the writers wanted the plot to reach its boiling point so quickly that they turned the burner on high heat and poured an entire bottle of salt in the pot, and it leaves the first half of the game feeling okay at best. Some of the most interesting moments happen in the second half, and it really could have benefited from a few more missions. One mission with your squad doing grunt work before your arrival at Britannia, one that serves as a bridge between landing in Britannia and capturing the leaders of the rebellion, and 1 or 2 missions about your trip back to Rome so we can see how badly the Empire has fallen into chaos as its entire cities have been overrun by the barbarians. This would bump the number from 8 to 12 and at least add another 2 hours of content. The only downside is that the gameplay might start to get stale, but I still think it would have been worth it for the entire story to feel a little more cohesive. Remember, this game is supposed to take place over the course of 10 years, and as of now, it feels more like 2. More missions would help add context to the timeline and answer questions like how did Marius get back to Rome. There's also the issue of the story feeling a little overdramatic when it doesn't need to be. I mentioned earlier that I had more thoughts on Boudica's death, and that's because I don't feel like she actually needed to die. By this point, Marius understands that her enemy isn't with Rome, but rather with Nero himself, and he's already avenged her father by killing Commodus, so why didn't he at least let her know this before killing her? She may have even offered to call off the invasion and retreat under the agreement that you kill Nero and then sign a peace treaty with the new emperor. Historically speaking, at least from what I've read, Boudica committed suicide via poison, so there's no historical reason that you can't change this. It's not like the game's trying to be 100% historically accurate either. With the inclusion of the gods, it's already broken off from that notion, and the real Boudican revolt took place entirely in Britain. It doesn't make a lot of sense as to why Boudica had to die the way she did in the game, and it seems like her issuing a retreat would have been much easier than placing her head somewhere high enough for everybody to see it, despite that probably being too high for anybody to even notice it, much less make out what it is. So the story we're left with has the potential to be great, but it wasn't given the attention it needed to reach that status. It's very dramatic, cinematic, and has a high level of presentation. John Hopkins did an amazing job voicing Marius, and every other character sold me with their performance. It's certainly not the worst story I've seen in a game, and it could best be described as a Call of Duty campaign in an ancient Roman setting. And to the right person, that'll be enough. Ryse Son of Rome is on the border of greatness, but it wasn't able to cross it. The combat is shallow and repetitive, there's no real form of progression, the bosses are boring and borderline unengaging, and the story just couldn't reach the heights it wanted to. And then we have the graphics, the quality of voice acting, realistic facial animations, and the spectacle to behold. I've asked myself several times throughout this project, was that all there was meant to be? Was the entire purpose of this game to be a flashy new launch title that shows off the Xbox One's hardware? Personally, I don't think so. The game's development is proof enough that Crytek had a vision for this game, and it turned out very different than how they expected. What I failed to mention is that Ryse was meant to be the foundation for a new franchise, but Ryse 2 was cut after Crytek and Microsoft had disagreements about who would hold the IP. Microsoft agreed to fund the game if they could claim the IP, and Crytek wouldn't agree. So Ryse falls into the category of franchises that will never get a sequel because of the gaming industry's business side. There's no doubt in my mind that Crytek would have refined the formula and developed an even better game with Ryse 2, and it could have been the game to fill the vacuum that God of War left after Ascension. But it wasn't meant to be. As it stands, we have a game that is too good to be considered fine, but not good enough to be considered great, and that's a real shame. I want to say I love this game, but that's not actually true. It's more that I love what this game could have been, and I likely would have loved the legacy that came after. These days, Crytek is focused more on making free-to-play and live service titles than actual video games, so it's not looking like we'll see Ryse 2, well, ever. But should Crytek decide to dust off their game development skills, take one more risk, and try to deliver a sequel to this game? Well, there are worse ways to spend my money. Thanks for watching, guys. I know this video is much shorter than the usual, but the good news is you didn't need to wait a full month for it. I've already started on my next project, so this didn't take much time away from anything. I'd like to try getting smaller videos out while I work on the bigger ones, but I don't always have that much time to pull it off. For everybody new to the channel, feel free to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and maybe consider subscribing. I also have a Discord server if you'd like to join and participate in our bi-monthly conversations. As always, I appreciate you guys for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.